is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and a leading authority on the history of slavery and abolition and the Civil War and Reconstruction. She was born in India and received her PhD from Columbia University, where her dissertation was nominated for the Bancroft Prize. She is the author of The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum South Carolina, which was named one of the 10 best books on slavery in Politico in 2015 and recently featured in the New York Times 1619 Project. Her multiple award-winning second monograph, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, was longlisted for the National Book Award for Nonfiction. It was named the Book of the Week by Times Higher Education to coincide with its UK publication and one of 3 great history books of 2016 in Bloomberg News. She is the recipient of numerous fellowships, including 2 year-long research fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities. In 2018, she was a visiting professor at the University of Paris, Diderot, and was elected to the Society of American Historians. She is a member of the Board of Society of Civil War Historians and of the Council of Advisors of the Lapidus Center for the Historical Analysis of Transatlantic Slavery at the Schomburg, New York Public Library. She taught at the University of Massachusetts Amherst for over 20 years, where she was awarded the Chancellor's Medal, the highest recognition bestowed on faculty. She is currently writing a book on the greater reconstruction of American democracy after the Civil War, which is under contract with Liveright Norton. Professor Sinha has written for numerous publications, which are listed in her bio, which can be found in the chat. I am pleased to, particularly because she is on leave from UConn, and I'm very honored that she is here with us. I'm very pleased to present to some and introduce to others, Dr. Manisha Sinha. Welcome.
Thank you, Vanita, for that very generous introduction. And I am really happy to be here with you to talk a little bit about why Kamala Harris is important and how her nomination really reflects a long history of activism by Black women. So I'm going to start sharing my screen with you. I hope this works. You all can see it clearly. Great. You know, as Vanita may have told some of you, I wrote this article on Kamala Harris, an op-ed in the New York Times, where I looked at how her nomination really reflected, you know, sort of generations of activism and intersections between African-American history and many immigrants of color, including Indian Americans who came to this country in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. But today what I want to do is take a deep dive into history and take you right back to the Revolutionary era, to the 18th century, and talk to you a little bit about how Black women have always been at the forefront of activism, of political activism in this country, you know, how that really came together with the abolition movement, which is what I wrote my second book on. I wrote this book called The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, which looked at the history of abolition from the Revolutionary era to the Civil War. And what I found in studying the history was the ways in which African Americans' roles had been marginalized in that history and the way they had been relegated, you know, as kind of a sideshow or literally as a separate topic that had no impact on the movement as a whole or in the march towards a greater democracy in this country. And so I really wanted to center their role. And particularly I found that one could center the role of Black women. So if you go right back to the 18th century and you look at one of the first women ever published, not just one of the first Black women ever published, but one of the first American women to be ever published. You get Phyllis Wheatley and her book of poems published in London in 1773, before the American Revolution. And here is Wheatley talking about her experience of being enslaved, on being brought from Africa. And if you read her poems closely, and if you read all her letters in which she says about the American revolutionaries, that she thinks, philosophers who are talking so much about liberty, that they would actually be aware of the fact that there are some people, who hold liberty just as dear and who are actually enslaved, unlike them who were complaining about political slavery to the British. So if you look at Black women's activism, you have to begin with Black women's writings. You have to begin with the ways in which African American have always contended for freedom. And in fact, in Massachusetts, there were two enslaved people who sued for their freedom during the Revolutionary era. One of them was with Freeman, or Mumbet, and her case went right up to the Supreme Judicial Court, and it led the state of Massachusetts to abolish slavery. So can you imagine that? Most people think of freedom as a gift handed down to Black people. Here is an instance which all my students in UMass were always astonished when I told them the story of these two freedom suits that went right up to the judicial court and resulted in the abolition of slavery. And so, if you think about something like the Dred Scott case, for instance, there's a long history of Black people suing for their own freedom, and particularly Black women. And in this particular instance, it was really consequential because it led actually to the abolition of slavery in one northern state. A lot of people forget that there was slavery in the northern states, that they got rid of slavery only in the Revolutionary era, which created that nation that was half slave and half free. Then if you look at the rise of the abolition movement in the mid-19th century, we can think about prominent white and Black abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, or, Frederick Douglass, or even David Walker, and his appeal to the colored citizens of the world is seen as the founding document of Black nationalism. But even here, Black women are taking the lead. So the American Anti-Slavery Society is only founded in 1833. But the first all-women's society, abolition society, was founded by Black women in Salem, Massachusetts in 1832. And Garrison is so astounded at this. He writes and says to white women, look at your Black sisters. They're forming abolition societies. You should do the same. And eventually the Salem Society allowed white women to join its group, but they were the pioneers. They were the ones who first founded this all-female anti-slavery society. There were other female anti-slavery societies in England, in other places. But in the United States, if you want to look at the first one, it's an all-Black one. Okay. And there were some really important Black women in this movement. Maria Stewart, who published her book of essays and speeches. It was helped published by William Lloyd Garrison. He published her also in his newspaper. Or somebody like Sarah Mapps Douglas of Philadelphia, who studied physiology, female physiology, and was teaching women about controlling their own bodies long before this became kind of a slogan in the 20th century. Or school teachers like Susan Paul, who wrote this book called The Memoir of James Jackson, where she tried to teach young children anti-racism. You hear that term now. It's become very fashionable. A lot of academics will talk about, attacking racism, teaching anti-racism. But here's Susan Paul writing a book in the 1840s, which is directed to school children, white and Black, and telling them how to become anti-racist. Then you look at the Fortin sisters, on whom John Greenleaf Whittier, the famous anti-slavery poet, actually wrote an ode to them. They were extremely important also in the abolition movement. They had literary societies, they held lectures on the Haitian Revolution, which is the only instance of a successful slave rebellion in world history. So they were radicals, they were very, you would think of them, these Northern Black women, as being sort of proper and presenting themselves in very respectable ways. But if you look at their politics, it's actually quite radical. And this kind of flows into the rise of a generation of Black abolitionist feminists who are very much involved in the abolition movement, but they're also involved in um, in the women's movement, in the rise of the early women's rights movement. And, you know, Sojourner Truth, of course, you know her, she is quite famous. And this is her famous Scots Die Visite, which she sold. I sell the shadow to support the substance. Now, Sojourner Truth was interesting because she was enslaved, of course, in the state of New York. She was not from the South. And she becomes famous not so much for her speeches in the abolition movement, but in the women's rights movement and the women's rights conventions. So it's really a white feminist who penned down her famous "Aren't I a Woman" speech. But, you know, there's some dispute whether she actually said those words, but she certainly traveled with a banner that said, "Aren't I a woman and a sister?" And then you had somebody like Frances Allen Watkins Harper, who was also very active in the women's movement. At the 1866 Women's Rights Conventions, she famously said, "You white women speak of rights, I speak of wrongs." So immediately bringing the perspective of a Black woman who had to deal with, indeed, the double burden of a race and sex. And then, of course, you have Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who is the first Black woman editor of a newspaper. She edits the Provincial Freeman in Canada. She comes back to the United States after the Civil War, gets a law degree, one of the first Black women to get a law degree, and of course also becomes very active in the suffrage movement after being very active in the abolition movement. So here are women whom we should know more about when we think about the history of abolition and the history of the women's rights movement. Finally, of course, Harriet Tubman, you know, who walked the walk and didn't just talk the talk. And she is one of the first, most famous, what I would call fugitive slave abolitionists of her generation, a person who escaped slavery and then went back down south to run off more slaves. As John Brown called her, he called her General Tubman. And he always called her a he. He didn't even use the term she, not because he questioned her femininity, but because she felt that these gender categorizations that we have of women being more feminine and men doing all the action were actually, he wanted to mix that up. And so he did that on purpose. And of course, I don't need to talk more about Tubman because everyone's heard of Harriet Tubman. And the other Harriet that other people may not have heard of is Harriet Jacobs, who wrote her famous Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, the iconic female slave narrative, where she talked about how she resisted abuse by her owner. And she was like, he had power on his side, but she had her own will. And she defied him. Her story is amazing, the way she hid in an attic for 7 years and eventually escaped slavery and became an abolitionist and prominent in abolitionist circles. So I would, you know, encourage anyone who's interested in the history to actually read her book because it is quite important. Now, from this history of Black women's activism within the abolition movement, the movement to abolish slavery, you get African-American suffragists. You know, we talk about the suffrage movement a lot, especially this year, you know, the centennial of the 19th Amendment, and we forget how important Black women were to that movement too. Of course, they're very important in their own spaces. You know, if you look at the National Association of Colored Women, which is founded in 1896, the Black Club Women, you look at Black women's work in churches, you look at Black women's work in, you know, benevolent societies, fraternal societies, community organizations. They're all over the place. But the fact is they're also in the suffrage movement. And we often forget that. We tell it only through the lens of white women. And the two most important Black suffragists in mind, the most famous, are certainly Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell. Mary Church Terrell, who comes to suffrage from the Black Women's Club movement, from the National Association of Colored Women, which she led for a long time. And of course, Ida B. Wells, who is extremely important for her anti-lynching campaign. She literally followed the footsteps of the abolitionists in making speeches against lynching, going all the way to England to sort of form a moral cordon sanitaire against white supremacists in the United States. So these women are extraordinary women, and even though they face sometimes instances of racism and racial paternalism within the suffrage movement, it doesn't deter them. They continue to make their presence felt and heard in the suffrage movement. And there are many stories connected with them. I won't go into detail. Some of you will probably know some of them, but I don't have that much time, and I am doing the broad sweep. Even if you look at some other Black women who have become very important in education, in Black fighting for Black voting rights at this time, against Jim Crow, against the regime of lynching and racial terror, like Ida B. Wells, Septima Clark, Mary McLeod Bethune. They all come out of a strong tradition of Black women's activism in the late 19th century. But the person who really thought about it and really wrote about Black feminism philosophically as a separate idea than just like plain feminism was certainly Anna Julia Cooper, who published her A Voice from the South in 1892. And she was talking about intersectionality long before we were, right? She's the one who said, when and where I enter, there enters with me the entire race, right? That Black women's concerns are not just women's concerns or just Black concerns or just concerns about class, that they are all interlinked, and that these were the issues that Black women fought for. And she was a very deep thinker. I find, in fact, that more philosophers study her than even historians because her work is so deep in terms of how she thinks about Black women's feminism. And I would encourage people to look at her. Now, because we're talking about Kamala Harris, I thought I'd draw your attention to this. W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, the great Black scholar and activist, one of the founders of the NAACP, dies eventually in Ghana during the civil rights movement, goes back to Africa. His radical imagination, it had a political side, the way he fought against Booker T. Washington, sometimes a lot of rivalry with Marcus Garvey. These are all great Black leaders and thinkers of that time period. And women are very important to all these movements. Booker T. Washington's wife is very active in the club movement. Marcus Garvey's wife is the activist in her own right. And if you look at Du Bois, he is forging through the NAACP connections with nationalist movements all over the world. So he's the one who is corresponding with Indian nationalists who are fighting for India's freedom against the British. He's the one who forms connections with African nationalists who are fighting for the freedom of African nations from European colonialism. So his radical imagination is very broad-based, it's international. And he wrote a novel also called, of course, The Dark Princess in 1928. And it's a really interesting novel because he talks about how a Black man falls in love with an Indian woman and they have a child. And that child, that son, is kind of a savior of the non-white world. And so it's so interesting that Du Bois in the early 20th century is imagining, because these things are not natural. There's a lot of racism, a lot of biases, a lot of cultural provincialism amongst lots of groups whom we think should actually be together. But in Du Bois, in his imagination, is imagining a racial solidarity with all non-white people all over the world. And I think it's important to know that Black thinkers kind of led that with Pan-Africanism, with decolonization all across the world. Then, of course, you have these fantastic women, the women of the civil rights movement, many of whom also made connections with the nonviolent struggle going on in India at that time, led by Mahatma Gandhi. So, of course, I don't need to introduce them to you. Ella Baker, Diane Nash, Fannie Lou Hamer. These were the stars of the civil rights movement. There were many other women, ordinary women, who marched, who did all the hard work of organizing in the civil rights movement. And I think we often forget them when we talk about the great sort of male leaders who were great, certainly. But these were the women who were really at the grassroots doing the hard work of organizing. And if you read any book on the civil rights movement that looks at the grassroots, they credit them with the strength of the movement. Then, of course, you have Shirley Chisholm, who is the first Black presidential candidate of a major party. There were Black women before that who had been, candidates of other sort of more minor parties, progressive parties, socialist parties. Even in the 19th century, there was a Black woman who attempted to run for the presidency, like Victoria Woodhull. But everyone knows about Victoria Woodhull, who is a white feminist radical, but they don't know many times about all these different African American women. Again, showing you that, for African American women, being disfranchised, doubly and triply disfranchised in this country has never been a constraint on their activism or their radicalism. And Shirley Chisholm is important. And of course, she was also from the Caribbean. Again, showing that sort of broader conception of Blackness as a constructed idea of having political solidarity across boundaries, because that's the way you win, by building the biggest and the largest political coalitions. And for the most part, the Black radical tradition has been like that. It's been very broad, it's been very capacious, welcoming, and it has included people from all over the world. And I think it's important to stress that. We often forget about Black feminists in the feminist movement. And I'm sorry that this picture is not particularly clear, downloaded from the internet, but I like this one in particular because it shows Gloria Steinem, who was, of course, the iconic figure of second wave feminism, with Dorothy Pitman Hughes. How many people have heard of Dorothy Pitman Hughes, who comes up, by the way, by herself with the idea of childcare? A very good friend of mine is writing a biography of her. And hopefully when that biography comes out, more people would have heard of Dorothy Pitman Hughes. Recently, they recaptured their iconic photograph from the 60s and 70s as older women. They're both still alive. And here they struck the same pose. And we must remember that when Gloria Steinem spoke at big gatherings, many times Dorothy Pitman Hughes also spoke at those gatherings. But how many people have heard of Dorothy, right? So again, showing that Black women have never been absent from the history of feminism in this country. Of course, you have the iconic Combahee River Collective. And here I'll ask you a question. Does anyone know why this Black feminist group that started meeting in the 1970s and 80s in Boston called themselves the Combahee River Collective? You can unmute yourself and answer the question. If anyone knows this, I ask this question in my class all the time. And if a student gets it, but usually they never get it. So that's why I'm asking. No one knows? Okay, I'll tell you. So it's called the Combahee River Collective because that is where Harriet Tubman led a raid against the Confederacy at the head of a Union Army regiment during the Civil War. So here are Black women really aware of that long tradition of Black activism. And of course, Tubman herself was a suffragist. We often forget that. She lived long enough to join the suffrage movement. She actually fought for a pension from the Union Army because she had served in the Union Army, and they refused to give her a pension because she was a woman. But her second husband was a Union Army veteran, much younger than her. And when he died, she got his pension, but they didn't give her her own, even though she had in fact participated as a scout for the Union Army and led this iconic raid on the Combahee River in South Carolina. The other Kamala Devi that I think many people don't know about, and I want to talk about her a little bit, is this woman, this Indian woman. While I was talking about Kamala Harris, I discovered her in other scholars' work. Her name was Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, and she came to the United States in the 1950s, where she met with Eleanor Roosevelt, and they were already talking about things like women's rights are human rights and how do we forward women's rights, etc. And she went down south and she got Jim Crowed in a streetcar a train, sorry, in a train in Louisiana. And the conductor told her, "You are not allowed to sit in this whites only section. You better move." And she's like, "No, I'm a colored woman and I will not move." And he's like, "Well, I guess you're Asian, so we let you stay here." And she's like, "No, I'm a colored woman and I will stay in the whites only section." So she again was trying to make a point there about not saying, "Don't let me just go because you think I'm a separate category. I'm Asian or Indian. No, I'm a color." And following her, of course, there were, just like many Black activists were, and Dr. King was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's teachings of nonviolence. Many Indians came actually to the South to fight for voting rights with African Americans. And I found instances of Indians who came to Harlem, intermarried with famous Black abolitionist families, and the DeGrasse family, for instance, is descended from Indians and African Americans. I found Indian immigrants at that time who just merged into the Black community and fought with the United States colored troops during the Civil War. So there's a long history of this kind of intermingling amongst Indian Americans and African Americans, which of course Kamala Harris's parents in a way personify. But what was interesting to me is that most Indians saw the civil rights movement also as connected to the fight for equality for all races all over the world. And many of them actually came to the South to join the civil rights movement. There were 2 Indian students from MIT who went down for Freedom Summer. I discovered many such little instances of Indian Americans being involved in the civil rights movement and attempting to contribute to it, besides the famous connections that we make between Gandhian Satyagraha and Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolent struggle. And because of the struggle of African Americans in the South, we get the Voting Rights Act, right, of 1965. And it's not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that most Black women get the right to vote. The 19th Amendment is passed in 1920, but for most African American women in the South, it's really difficult to vote because they're being Jim Crowed like Black men. So it's only after 1965 that you see the emergence of Black women as a viable political force in American life. There were Black women in Chicago, in Boston, very active. They're involved with the election of the first Black congressman since Reconstruction in the South. But really as a force in politics, you see this come about after the Voting Rights Act. And the fact that the section of the Voting Rights Act has been dismantled by the Supreme Court in the famous Shelby versus Holder case is unfortunate. Because it's really through the Voting Rights Act, the mechanisms put in place by the federal government to prevent voter suppression, that has allowed our democracy to flourish. And attempts to dismantle the Voting Rights Act or Citizens United get big money into politics and use all kinds of tricks in order to fraud people out of their right to vote. That is something that is still going on. This notion that somehow this struggle is over after the civil rights movement, which is the way a lot of people viewed it, is simply not true. It continues to be contested. But I'd like to end by saying that Black women are the most progressive voting bloc in American politics today. They are the backbone of the Democratic Party, and in a way, Kamala Harris's nomination recognizes that. And they continue to be active in the grassroots, in community organizations, in their churches, in sororities like the AKA, which Kamala Harris is part of, in the HBCUs, which were founded immediately after the Civil War. These are legacies of Black activism coming from abolition from the 19th century to the Civil War. And sometimes people are just not aware of that long thread of protest and activism. And it's important to remember that, especially in these times when our voting rights are again under challenge and when, kind of open white supremacy is being espoused from the current occupant of the White House. So it is important for us to, in fact, reclaim our voting and reclaim our democracy, and think about all these people who were fighting at times that were even more dismal than perhaps our times. When we think of the struggle against slavery, the struggle against Jim Crow, the struggle to win the right to vote for women. So that is pretty much the end of my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and would be happy to answer any questions or comments you may have.
This was so good. Oh my goodness.
Thank
Thank you so much. Dr. Warren, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Uh, Dr. Sinha, thank you so much. This has been so wonderful and so enlightening. And I apologize. As I said in the beginning, I was kind of multitasking. Uh, so I don't want to demean or diminish your presentation, because it was just truly wonderful. We know so much about some of the women that you spoke about, but it's nice to hear all of this as a collective thing, and it just brings out the importance of, how Black women have influenced the, this whole thing of suffraging and voting. So I'm just very pleased to see it in this body of material. I wanted to say too, there's an organization in Boston. Well, she's actually online. She's a former student of mine, and she has developed something called the Nasty Collaborative. And you might want to just look that up as a modern day kind of abolitionist group. And she is online. Sarah Bob is her name. And there, when you were mentioning, I don't want to be so long here, but you were mentioning some of the more modern women like Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and Diane Nash. We have a person here in Bergen County who is also among this group. Her name is Theodora Lacey, and you might add her to your collection. She was with the Montgomery boycott movement. And I don't want to say too much more about that, but she is just one of our modern day leaders. So thank you again. This is, as I said, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for coming. I'll check out the Nasty Collaborative. I guess we have a quote, nasty women, right?
Yes.
One of the things that Dr. Warren didn't mention about Theodora Lacey, and yeah, she's such a prominent figure, not just in Teaneck, New Jersey, but all over. She is responsible for Teaneck, New Jersey, which is where we're from, being the first town to voluntarily integrate its public school system. Yeah, so she helped with integrating our town, and the town served as a model throughout the United States in various capacities. So, and a school was just named in her honor. So we're just so very proud of Mrs. Lacey. She was a teacher in town, and she has a Wikipedia. So anyway, so I thank you, like Dr. Warren, for just everything that you shared. And it was so nice to just see just the collection of Black women, and you're highlighting the first Kamala, the Indian woman who refused to go to the back of the bus. That was very powerful to hear her story. One of the things I was thinking about was, Kamala Harris identifying as, she's Indian and Jamaican, she's a Black woman. And I was just thinking about my relationship that I have as a Black woman with Indian women. And it was fascinating to hear you talk about the ways that Blacks and Indians work together, and we're in the struggle together. And even with you mentioning Du Bois and his work with Indian activists and African activists, like that was new to me, because sadly, I was told that in India, there's still some anti-Black sentiment. And I'm just wondering whether or not you feel that's still true, and are there collectives here that are still working together that you know about?
Yeah, that's a great question, Vanita, because this trying to make an alliance between communities, it's not natural. As I said, the political activists have worked on it, and they work on it by constructing ideologies of solidarity and saying, okay, we are all people of color and we're going to resist this together, right? So that's like a political project. But then when you look at society, and this is then Isabel Wilkerson's new book on caste, even though she, I think, caste is not so simple in India. It's so complicated that, frankly, as an Indian, I even don't understand it sometimes. Because they're like not just like the four main castes, they're like hundreds of subcastes, and then thousands of subcastes, and some subcastes don't even know which caste they belong to because it's been devolved into so many different things. So it's a complicated subject. But you're right, there is a lot of colorism in the Indian community, and it begins mainly with the colonization of India and white supremacy, where you had kind of Jim Crow in India. Like my father growing up in India, when India was colonized by the British, would tell me there would be signs in parks saying Europeans only, Indians and dogs not allowed, like watching a Jim Crow sign. And that's why, I think Du Bois was able to connect with Indian nationalists. And even the lower castes in India sometimes I looked at the abolition of slavery and used that as a model. But colorism really became ubiquitous after the British came in, the British rule, that somehow a lighter skin means, being more civilized. It's associated with standards of intelligence and beauty and all the whole racist superstructure of, it was really enforced, I would say, and many Indians internalized it. They internalized, even though ironically, all our gods are so black that they have to be painted blue, traditionally in Indian culture. So like our Indian goddess Kali, that word means black. And that's actually a very common name now amongst African American women. A lot of my students were called Kali deliberately because they knew about this. And I was like, wow, you all know about it. Or at least their parents did, right? Just like there in the 19th century, a lot of Black male children were called Maceo after the Afro-Cuban nationalists, or Toussaint after the Haitian revolutionary. So African Americans have had this imagination, right? And as I said, it is a matter of constructing it. Within the Indian community, I find, like, leaving India, where I think colorism is really bad, and it's there in Africa too. They always sell these skin lightening creams for women in particular. There's a lot of pushback against it, and we are having our Black is Beautiful moment right now in India, so we are a few decades behind. But this is an issue that continues to be there in the community and is being addressed openly. Amongst the Indian American community, a lot of them don't realize that the only reason they're here in this country, particularly in New Jersey, or like huge amounts of Indian Americans there, is because of the new Immigration and Naturalization Act that I talked about in my article. Without the civil rights movement, you wouldn't have Indian Americans in America, because we were literally not allowed to come into the country because it was the 1924 law was very racist. It actually didn't even allow many Southern Europeans to come to this country. It was all Northern Europeans. So when Trump says, I want immigrants from Norway. He's going back to the 1924 law. A lot of Italian Americans actually came to this country by walking across the border like Mexicans. You know, they were the ones called, quote, wetbacks first, because they were trying to get into the country. So the whole immigration regime was really racist. The only reason Indian Americans are here or Asian Americans are here is because of the civil rights struggle and the new Immigration Act. And many Indian Americans will adopt the attitude of immigrants, which is, you know, one way to Americanize or is to adopt the privileges of whiteness and to look down upon Black people. And that's happened with, you know, the Irish immigration to this country, with the Southern and Eastern immigration. We have wonderful immigration historians who've talked about, you know, whiteness and how people assume the privileges exactly in order to be assimilated into the United States. And you can see that with Asian immigrants too, from India, from, you know, other parts of Asia where they do this. But on the other hand, I think we still have this political legacy of the civil rights movement and of the Indian national struggle. And most Indians are aware of that. And that's why you get, you know, Indian Americans voting like 70, 80% for the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party. They face sometimes the same issues that African Americans do to a lesser degree, but similar kinds of issues of being, you know, profiled by the police. There was that famous instance of the Indian grandfather who was slammed to the ground and died actually in Georgia. This was, I think, a few years ago. So when people talk about police brutality or systemic racism, I think a lot of immigrants of color to this country they see it, right? Even though they're being relatively privileged, because the kind of immigrants allowed to this country have always been, you know, people with skills. You know, even the Immigration Act of 1965 made it clear that you just can't come to this country. You come like Kamala Harris's mother comes on a student visa for higher education. You already on a trajectory where you have access to good jobs, good neighborhoods, good schools. In a way that, you know, a lot of indigenous communities, a lot of communities of the color in this country don't have. And so, you know, one has to constantly explain those things and to think about solidarity, as I said, as a political project, because it's not natural. You're right, there's a lot of racism. The Indian community also tends to be very insular. You know, they tend to like typical Asian immigrants, they just tend to, you know, be by themselves and mingle with themselves. Of course, there are always a lot of exceptions. And Kamala Harris's mother comes to mind. There's an excellent article in the New York Times, which I would recommend, looking at the founding of the Afro-American Association in Berkeley, which was a radical Black organization of students. They were one of the first champions of Black studies, of Black history. And that's where, you know, that's the organization through which Shamla meets Robert Harris, Kamala Harris's father. And a lot of like real Black radicals like Cedric Robinson, who wrote Black Marxism, and racial capitalism, ideas about racial capitalism that historians at Harvard and Cornell today are using to write about slavery, mind you. And he was with her in Berkeley too. And in his acknowledgments, he mentions Kamala Harris's mother's name in his book, which is, to me, astounding. So this New York Times reporter investigated that, Ellen Barry, and she wrote an article on it, I think a few weeks ago, which is worth looking at too, because she found stuff that I hadn't either. Because, you know, I'm a 19th century historian of slavery and abolition. I don't do 20th century history, except I teach African American history broadly, but I don't research it as such for the 20th century. And so I found that story fascinating.
Thank you so much. We have our provost with us, Dr. Jassy. I know you came from another meeting. Would you like to say hello or?
Well, I thank you so much, Vinayda, and I do apologize so much. I had this on my calendar, and I had a meeting. In my world, some of these meetings run long, unexpectedly, so I do beg your forgiveness. I'm just so delighted that Dr. Rodman Jenkins was able to secure you as a speaker. I remember reading your op-ed in the New York Times and found it so interesting. So when I saw the flyer, I was like, oh, I have to get this on my calendar. And I understand that the talk is recorded, so I'm looking forward to hearing it in its entirety. But this is a fascinating topic, absolutely fascinating. India is a kind of unknown world to me in many ways, and as you just described the caste system, it's something that I wish I could learn more about, just to know the history and these nuances. It's just a fascinating world to me, and I think that I love the Kamala connection, and it's I'm just enriched by this perspective that you bring, and I'm really I'm just thrilled that you're with us and be able to share your research.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and making the time, because I know at your level, the kinds of pressures you have in terms of your calendar and just having many administrative meetings, I'm sure. So I appreciate.
Well, much of it truly is mind numbing. So this is a breath of fresh air in my day. I can't tell you, I don't do my scholarship really anymore, and so when I can hear an academic, this is just, it's like lifeblood to hear an academic talk. So believe me, I would have cut the call earlier if I could have.
So much. No worries. Thanks. I appreciate that. But, I think what you said is so important about how Kamala Harris identifies herself. She refuses to choose. She asserts her African American identity. The fact that she chose to go to Harvard, that she was an AKA. I mean, she was brought up as a Black woman, and she feels strongly about that. You can clearly see that. At the same time, she doesn't sort of downplay her Indian American side either. She talks about that too. So, increasingly we are getting people who have all these multiple identities in the United States. I have an uncle who married an African American woman, and they have kids. They live here, and they identify as Black completely. They don't. They don't see it as problematic somehow, the way people looking in from the outside, do. We know that this is increasingly a place where people from all over the world are sort of like, finally we're getting somewhat of a little bit of that melting pot. So yeah, on the other hand, I think it is very important to also look, I've written a lot on reparations and slavery reparations. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal last year that got a lot of attention on reparations. I think it's really important to look at the very particular instances of systematic disfranchisement that people of African descent have faced in this country. And so one should not lose sight of that either. And I'm kind of mindful of that, because I constantly teach the histories of slavery and the afterlives of slavery. But I really like the way Kamala kind of embraces all sides of her identity. I think that's what makes her an attractive candidate.
Yeah, I find it remarkable, truly. Just this cultural commingling, it's such a richness in our culture. I grew up myself with very mixed cultures, and I think that it enriches everybody's life. So I don't know, Kamala Harris is a fascinating person from that perspective. So.
Thank you. While I appreciate it, Dr. Jassy, I'm Reverend Vinita Rodman Jenkins, not doctor, but thank you for that anyway.
Oh.
It's all good. I go for Rev or MS, but that's fine.
Okay. All right. You're Rev to me. You're Rev to me now.
Thank you.
It would be a better title than doctor, actually. Right.
Does anyone have any other comments or questions? We'll take a couple more minutes.
Sure. I just had one comment or thought. Dr. Manisha, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation, and it always, I enjoy history, and it always frustrates me when you share such rich history, and a lot of it's so new to me, but I really appreciate all that you shared, and, giving me some places to kind of do some further study. And one of the things that really resonated with me was Susan Paul, was it?
Yeah.
Susan Paul, anti-racist back in 1840. That really struck me. As I'm here, and right now we're talking about Kendi and how to be an anti-racist, and just realizing, wow, I had no idea that that term or that whole concept was thought about so long ago. And I was just wondering, like, how do you think, or why do you think those terms come and go or die, and they come back and appear so new? Like, why do you think that happens? Or
That's a great question, Todd. And I know Abraham really well. I actually wrote for his tenure when he was in Florida. And now he's at BU. I think he's a fellow also at the Radcliffe Institute, where I was last year. And, the thing is, I think people just don't know the history. When I used to teach African American history, it used to bother me that students would write papers saying, oh, slavery is so bad, racism is so bad. And I'm like, you're disrespecting the subject if you're just going to give me your opinion. You have to research it. You have to give it the same amount of attention and care and scholarship that you would any other subject. This is not just a political project. This is also a scholarly enterprise. So I would demand the highest standards of scholarship from my students, and they all rose to the challenge. And now I have all these wonderful young men and women all over the country teaching African American history. We even got a prize from the American Historical Association for placing the most number of African American academics in institutions of higher learning across the country. And it's really important because this history is so exciting. Like anti-racism, we think of it as a modern idea that, and I think Ibrahim's really, his recent work, he's certainly done that. But I think it is important to remember that African Americans have always been in that anti-racist struggle. And, if you look at Susan Paul or some of the other figures I talk about in my book, who are like forgotten, like this guy, William Whipper, they are fighting against scientific racism, the most crudest kind of scientific racism, which at that time, by the way, was the dominant idea even in universities and colleges. Today, no right-thinking person is going to say those things, right? It has to be some lunatic in the right fringe or Trump saying that. But in that time, that was intellectually respectable, that kind of hard racism. And the only people challenging them were African American writers, thinkers, teachers like Susan Paul. And so I wrote a lot about them in my book. I have a chapter called The Black Man's Burden, where I see how they take on both popular culture, but also intellectual culture, which is at that time already coming up with this idea of IQs, and some people are inherently inferior, women are inherently inferior, they're too emotional, etc. All the pernicious things that we associate with racism and sexism were intellectually respectable then. It's not until Nazis made racism unfashionable, this was the common discourse in the West. And the only people challenging them within the West, not outside, but within are, some really prominent African Americans, and whose writings are there. I mean, they published, their books are there. When I was writing my book, the reason it took me so long and it ended up being a big book was I'm like, wait a minute, why isn't anyone talking about this person or this person who published their book? Why isn't anyone talking about James W.C. Pennington, who also wrote an anti-racist text? And he was a Reverend, Benita. He is the first Black man to be ever given an honorary doctorate from the University of Heidelberg in 1849. And I think when they celebrated Heidelberg's 625th anniversary as a university, they endowed a fellowship in Pennington's name. And they invited me to, talk about it because no one had heard of Pennington or had written much about Pennington. A few historians here and there, but no one had really appreciated everything that he had done. And when I did that talk, President Obama, at that time we actually had a president, sent his greetings and compared himself to Pennington. He's like, I like Pennington, and Pennington was a fugitive slave like Tubman. And he's like, I like Pennington, came from nowhere and became the president. And, it was kind of interesting to see his greetings. But to me, that was like a big thing that the university was recognizing it. And there's so many more such stories that I came across as I was researching and writing my book. I found that there was really, even though there had been books written about Black abolitionists, they really hadn't comprehended their significance, both to the movement and to the broader culture. So if you're in 19th century and you're looking for an Ibram, you would find not just Frederick Douglass, who is the most well-known, but you would find hundreds of such people, literally hundreds. And some of them wrote, they had their own newspapers, they did all kinds of things. And one of the reasons that I wrote that book was because I felt people have not given these people their due. And that's why we don't know them, because they've been neglected. People didn't think their ideas were worth studying. Certainly, the American historical profession was pretty segregated and dominated by a certain narrative. And I'm not saying let's, throw everything out and have something totally new. I don't believe in that. I just think that our past is so much more interesting and complex. And, it's neither all this or that. And we need to be able to tell those stories so that people today realize, that their activism has a history. And, as a historian, of course, I always think history is really important. But for me, it was important that the people who really identified with my book and all the research I had done on these forgotten Black figures were current day activists. And that's why the book made it. It was not because it was big in academia. It did well there, but it was, the moral majority people in North Carolina or a Black Lives Matter chapter in Chicago. Suddenly they found the book, or a prison abolition movement that was using the term abolition, or Black nationalists saying, oh, now we know why this newspaper was called The Liberator, because it was from Garrison's Liberator. So, they started making those connections. And I sort of end the book with actually pointing them out and saying, that there's a history to the movement for Black lives. There's a history to the struggle against mass incarceration and the criminalization of Blackness. All the kinds of things that we struggle with today, I found evidence of people struggling with it in the 19th century. And that's why I like to think of American democracy not as a linear progressive project. It's always contested. It's not as if African Americans happily accepted, where they were. I see them maybe more powerfully than Ibram does. I see them as anti-racist, as laying the groundwork of anti-racism. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinha. We appreciate your time and your work and all that you have shared with us this afternoon. It was rich, it was enlightening. It was inspiring. And I know that you're on leave, and the fact that you took the time to come to be with us today means so, so much. And I just want to say thank you and that we appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Benita. It was really lovely to meet everyone. So yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Part of your work there. Thank you.
Thank you. So enjoy the rest of your day. We thank you all for coming. I can call everyone by name now. Todd and Dr. Jassy and Dofi and Nelson, Crystal, Dr. Warren, Lily Beth. We appreciate you all for coming today and continue to carry the work forward. So.